All right. Good morning. On day two of our A-Push class, I'm sorry that I am absent today, um, but you should be watching this video to start off your class after, right? You have done this opening quiz that I gave you through the Google form, just to kind of jog your memory about some key historical happenings, if you will, from in early American history. Now, the thing to remember is that when I ask you to identify, list, define, recite, recall, that's what I would call these level one questions. You're really not going to see a lot of that in A push. We do a lot more extended analysis type questions, especially with respect to documents. But that doesn't mean that you don't need to know your history. You need to know your history. You need to have this ability to identify and recall facts, right? To drop into your written responses. Your analysis has got to be backed up by factual data. So let's see how we did on this quiz, right? The conquistador who conquered the Inca, you should have said Pizarro. Cortez, if he answered him, conquered the Aztecs. The leader of the Massachusetts Bay Colony who wrote about a city upon a hill is John Winthrop. The crop that financially saved Jamestown, I hope you all know, is tobacco. The religious group that advocated pacifism and the separation of church and state were the Quakers. A term for a worker whose Atlantic passage was paid for in exchange for an agreed upon period of labor is an indentured servant. Law passed in Maryland that provided free practice of religion to Christians. I had to move my camera, make sure that I got that key part of the question in there. And that would be the Toleration Act, the Maryland Act of Toleration. The English law that stated trade within the empire must be conducted on English ships is the Navigation Act. So we'll come up to these types of questions. Perhaps some things you did not yet know. Okay, but when we have the ability to identify and recall and we know our history, right, then we can get into more analysis, which is something like we are going to work on right now. Okay, I'm going to show you an SAQ question, which I assume most of us have not really done before, right? You may have had something like this in AP World, okay? Our summer assignment used to be SEQs, but we got away from that because there's a very particular type of writing that we need to teach you on the SAQs. Whereas when you have an LEQ like you had for your summer assignment, that's kind of a little bit more traditional. You're used to writing in something approximating, right, like that classic 5-paragraph type essay. The question I want to give to you, and we're going to talk a little bit about it. We're going to see some documents about it. We're going to talk about how to write these responses, and this is a large part kind of my lesson here today, and you're going to get some practice, is this. One, briefly explain one example of how contact between Native Americans and Europeans brought changes to Native American societies in the period 1492 to 1700. Two, or B, briefly explain a second example of how contact between Native Americans and Europeans brought changes to Native American societies in the same period. So two different examples here, right? And then third, briefly explain one example of how European groups sought to implement change in the same period. What were they trying to accomplish, right? And so we probably know some of this. We have to know how to write about it. And let's take also a look at not just kind of how to write about it, but like what we can include. So when we talk about how to write about it, right? About 3 sentences for each response is what you should do. We should ACE, right? We want to answer, cite, explain. That's what we mean by ACE. So with answer being first, you should attack the question. Attack the question in your very first sentence. You want to leave no doubt to your reader, this is my claim. This is my historical claim. Okay. Set up the time period. Say one example. It's almost like what I would call a TTQA, turn the question around or restate the question, but you don't get points for that. You get points for giving an historically accurate, defensible answer within that framework. We're going to try to do that in our first sentence on an SAQ because we want to be judicious with our time and our language. Okay. Secondly, cite. That doesn't mean to cite some historian or book you read. You are citing evidence. This is where you've got to have that recall. You are saying, hey, this is historical fact, and this fact backs up my claim. And if it's that, to make that, I should say, to make that explicitly clear, you've got to go to the E in ACE. Answer, cite, explain. So now you explain or you expand upon how your cited evidence supports the claim that you made in your A, your answer. So we're going to do a lot of work on that this year, and this is kind of our first opportunity to do so. Okay. As is often the case in APUSH, there will be oftentimes documents to go along with your essay. So I want to show you a couple source documents that you might be able to use as inclusion for supporting your claim in the essay you're about to practice. Okay. I'm going to give you 3 documents. I want you to try to identify generally, hey, what is this document? Where is it coming from? What's the purpose? When is this coming from? What's the message here? Is there bias? Is there a point of view that's trying to be explained to me? Could you write a paragraph saying, hey, this is what this document is. This is what this document is showing. This is why this document is important. Okay. So as you do these little analysis here on these documents, I want you to maybe jot down some notes and then do your essay where you would normally take notes for this class. So some of you may be typing. If some of you are old school and you're writing in a notebook, that's fine. Okay, but we're going to analyze some documents and we're going to write an essay. All right, in SAQ, we're going to address that question. So let's take a look at document A. I will say nothing. You can pause your screen. Don't do it for more than a minute or so. We have a schedule to keep to. And analyze this document. Again, keep it to about a minute. Screenshot it if you want. But I am going to move on from this document to the next right now. So pause it if you need it for another minute. Here is your document B. What is this showing us? Can we try to imagine the time period, the source, the purpose? Why is this historically significant? Document B. Pause it if you need to. I'm going to give you document C, some text on this next document. All right. So 3 different types of documents, right? We have a map, we have an image of some sort there, and here we have kind of a wall of text that you need to kind of decipher and extract from there what is really important. All right, I'm going to move on. I'm going to show you again your question, briefly explain one example of how contact between Native Americans brought changes to Native American societies in the period 1492. Same thing, a second example for part B. And a third example, sought to implement change, how Europeans sought to implement change. All right, so that's what you're going to do. 3 sentences labeled ABC, attack, 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 cite, 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 explain, explain, explain. 3 succinct answers here. To get us used to timing for this, I'm going to ask you in a second to pause the video, put on a timer for 11 minutes max, in class, at home, wherever you are. Take 11 minutes and write this SAQ. Write it again in a document or on a notebook, wherever you're normally going to keep your notes. Okay. So that is what you are doing. It's practice. Let's go do it now. And I'll leave a screen up here with some larger print for you. 11 minutes, go. Okay. Presumably, it's 11 minutes later, and I want you to self-evaluate your essay right now. Is it clearly labeled and neatly written, or are you risking losing points because you don't know how to label or you don't know how to write neatly? Can you determine the answer via the opening sentence? Do you attack it? And is it historically accurate? Do you know your stuff here? Do you adequately explain and expand upon how that cited evidence supports your claim? Do you follow the format for ACE? All right. So begin to evaluate our own writing, at least under these bare minimum kind of conditions, kind of requisites here. Okay. I do want to show you a sample that was done by a student in time and done very well. I'm going to allow you, rather than my doing it, I'm going to allow you to read that right now. Now, keep in mind, you probably have about 13 minutes to do an SEQ. What you see here can be done in that time frame. You see the question, you might see the documents, you prepare your answer, you're 2 minutes down, and you're looking at, can you write each one of these paragraphs in about 3 minutes and 35 seconds, 3.5 minutes. Okay. And that's about where you want to be. And you can see this would be a high scoring response. We attack each question, we cite evidence, we go on to explain. What we do in our AP writing, guys, is this. Okay. We pound our readers for points. Understand, when you take the exam, these essays are being graded by some guy in some hotel room in Omaha, Nebraska, where he's reading essays for 5 days. It sounds miserable. So when he reads your essay or she reads your essay, get up there and punch your reader in the face with your history. Don't waste time with flowery language. Everything you do, we want to grab 4 points. And hopefully you see that here. You read this essay, and the reader has no choice but to give this student high marks. Okay. But that's where I wanted to kind of get into. We're talking here in this first period about history. We're talking about the first contact, right, between the exploring Europeans and those native to this continent, as well as then this age of European exploration and competition for American soil. And we'll see how that plays itself out, both between the European nations as well as with respect to the natives. Okay, so keep in mind kind of some of the things we're getting into, and we're going to get into some of that with some class notes. I'm going to try to move pretty quickly right now because it's really basic stuff that I actually don't expect to see on an exam, but we need to kind of lay out some foundation for where we're going to understand the essential questions for this unit. And so take notes wherever it is that you would normally take notes, okay? What we are talking about here today is getting up towards, the Columbian exchange idea and all that. Might be a little bit later than today's lecture, okay? But what I want you to understand is for every unit that we do, as I showed to you yesterday, we've got this unit map, and you've got essential questions right at the top of the document. And so I want us to try to see if we can develop an answer to these essential questions as we move through this study. We have three big ideas we need to talk about. Okay. And everything we're doing here falls into the key concepts 1.1 or 1.2 from the College Board. Okay. All right. Let me let me get going. All right. Um, so obviously, we go back to the history of the first peoples in North America, and we're talking about the Native Americans or the first Canadians crossed over that frozen Bering Land Bridge 30,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago. Okay. Um, and we want to understand too this concept, if some of you had us in geography, about push pull, right? When people make human migrations, one of the themes, human migration movement of the A-Push curriculum, we want to understand why people are making moves. Okay, are they pushed from one place involuntarily, or are they voluntary migrating to another place, and for what motivation? And that's going to guide kind of why people move around the globe. Okay, they are pushed out of one place and they are pulled to another where maybe some of those negative push factors don't exist. um, these peoples happen to be a lot of nomadic tribes that would follow herds of animals. Okay. Um, and there was about the end of the 15th century, before the exploration, the discovery of America, the Americas in total, south up to throughout North America, was about 60 million people, about the same number of people that populated Europe. Now, who were these people that populated these 60 million people? Who were they? Well, they were Native Americans. They were what we call Native Americans, or Canadians call first Canadians. Um, Most of the early societies that you're more familiar with were in what we would call Latin America. The Mayas, Aztecs, Incas, very complex structures to their societies, their economic practices, their religious practices. And in North America, that, not Latin America, but in present day United States, okay, I want you to think, when I say Native Americans, who are they? Who are some of these civilizations? And what you probably ended up doing is coming up with some tribes like we see on this map up here, right? And if you're a lacrosse fan like I am, you notice, the Haudenosaunee and the Iroquois tribes, confederated tribes, were big lacrosse cultures. But you probably came up with some names, maybe like Iroquois or Cherokee, Seminole, Cheyenne, Navajo. Okay. Um, and I want us to get into some of this work here a little bit later. Okay. Because we want to understand, now we're focusing on, right, on American history. And from time period one, is prior really to, or through time period one, I should say, really includes a lot of the initial contact with Native Americans, and we want to understand what was this land, and that's going to play a role in understanding kind of the foundation, some later actions of the American government, and what we see in American history. Okay, so Columbus, of course, 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, right? Looking for, it truly was a new world to Columbus. And when we take a look at this map here, right, and the one on the left here, you see the old world had, as it were, had no accounting for what was beyond the Atlantic. They thought that it was going to be a route back to India, kind of around the world. And here we embark then on this epic period of American exploration, okay, and European competition for North American soil that's going to play a major role in American history, really from about 1607 until well, even beyond the founding of our country. When we get into even the 1800s, where America is still um, expanding with manifest destiny across the continent. Okay, and that'll continue to play a role in the story that is to be told about the Native Americans in this land. All right. Uh, Now, so as you may have read in the essay, right, what is the motivation behind this age of exploration, right? And it's going to be boiled down to a catchphrase, the three G's: God, glory, and gold. Now, that is quite literally the motivation of the conquistadores, right? Most of the early exploration is led by Spain and Portugal. Um, and they were quite literally looking to spread Christianity to these savages of the new land, and we'll kind of examine that label a little bit. Gold to get rich, okay, um, or glory for the conquistadores themselves, or for the crown, right? To bring glory to the crown, to bring glory to themselves, to put themselves in the history books. There's the motivating factors in the early age of this European expansionism comes down to this concept of the three G's. Later, that becomes a little bit more figurative, but the truth holds nonetheless. Right? When the English, and you read about this in that short answer, when the English start coming here, their first success is through a profit motive, the joint colonies, the joint stock companies, I should say. Okay. These are, if you think of it like corporate funded expeditions to this new world. Um, and there's profit motives, right? The crown, when we get into this concept of mercantilism during the American colonial age, the British crown is just looking to get wealthy off of these possessions. That is mercantilism, right? That this economic philosophy that the colonies exist only to bring wealth to the mother country. Um, and so, yeah, for a while that may have been literal gold, and later it was through trade and foodstuffs and raw materials. And so the motivations, the bare bone motivations exist. As you guys will hear me say this here too, what's the number one answer to every question ever asked? Money. You want to find an answer to something, follow the money. Okay. So don't ever exclude economic motivations for why you see an action take place in history. Um, Now, it hasn't always been framed to us like that, right? We have been told from elementary school about the great European explorers discovering this continent, bringing God, uh, saving the savages. Um, but what I want you to consider as we get into day two of class here is understanding kind of some different takes, some different perspectives, points of view, POV, or bias that we see in history. And that could include primary sources, right, which is a source from the time period we're studying, a newspaper, a flyer, a diary, a painting, all right, or secondary source, an historian's work. And of course, every historian, myself included, you as you study history, right? We have implicit bias within us, how we expect to, how we want to view things. And some of that has been built into our culture. And you're seeing here a passage, a man by the name of Larry Schweikert. I want you to take a minute and read this passage from Schweikert's book, A Patriot's History of the United States. So, what trips me up here, right, is that we see, let's take a look at some of the language that Schweikert uses, okay? God, glory, gold, not necessarily in that order, took post-Renaissance Europeans to part of the globe they had never seen before. Listen to how he talks about Columbus. He embodies the best of a new generation of navigators, resilient, courageous, and confident. He says, Columbus, that is, God has endowed me with a great talent for seamanship, sufficient ability in astrology, geometry, and arithmetic, and the mental and physical dexterity required to draw spherical maps. To be sure, Schweikert goes on, Columbus wanted glory, and a motivation born of desperation fueled his vision. At the same time, Columbus was earnestly desirous of taking Christianity to heathen lands. And he goes on in the last paragraph to talk about how he finds these Indians interesting and he hopes to convert them to our holy faith by love rather than by force, giving them gifts. Okay. And here is the great European explorer coming into Americas and serving God in uh, in good standing, right? Now, Schweikert wrote this book, A Patriot's History of the United States, because this is his lens on history. The kind of a little bit more traditional lens on history that you may have gotten growing up in elementary school and middle school. He titles his book A Patriot's History of the United States for one reason only, to contrast the work of another author by the name of Howard Zinn. And Howard Zinn wrote a book, A People's History of the United States, right? You may catch, if you're politically astute, you might catch a people's history. So this is connotation. Zinn is almost seen as a socialist. What Zinn does is writes about a capitalist society in America from the perspective of the loser. Okay. So this is his perspective. This is his bias. And you see the same event described, the meeting of natives for the first time with Christopher Columbus. And it's a radically different approach. All right, as these men, these Arawaks, swim out to greet Columbus. This is Columbus's own words. This is a primary source here within the secondary source of Zinn. And this is what Columbus says about meeting these Indians. They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for glass beads and hawks' bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They are well built with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know of them, for I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. And if you're not familiar with the term subjugate, we'll look it up, okay? Because we need to expand our vocabulary, high school juniors. We have the same incident described here, radically different take. Zinn, however, hey, he provides a direct quote from Columbus, whereas Schweikert was saying, he says, hey, he gives them red caps and glass spirits and many other small things, things of small value. And Columbus himself describes it really as a trade here and ends his explanation with, hey, we can make these people our slaves. Okay. So it's really important that we hear both sides of this history and try to make an authentic, educated, valid argument about where the truth lies. Okay. But we need to recognize bias in order to do it. And I'm here to tell you that a lot of your history so far has probably been the Schweikert version. And we want to shift things now that we're juniors in AP classroom. We want to shift some of our thinking where we are able to listen and really if you paid attention to the first article I gave you and the video that I gave you for homework that you did prior to today's class, there's an emphasis upon listening and understanding the perspective of others. One of my favorite bands, Rage Against the Machine. Was supposed to see them recently, but hey, worldwide pandemic. They have a song called "Sleep Now in the Fire," and you can see what Rage's perspective here when he talks about Columbus is: "I am the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, the Newson, the rapist, the fields overseer." So we hear how songwriter Zach De La Roca might have his bias, his perspective on Columbus, and clearly would probably align a little bit more with Howard Zinn. But it's a very interesting exercise when we start to question both our primary and our secondary sources. Hey, where are these things coming from? What are they trying to tell us? Can I fact check some of this stuff? Do I really understand my history? Okay, so a lot about kind of point of view today. And one of the points of view we are going to get into right now with the time you have remaining in class and for homework tonight. We are getting into an assignment called the Native American Graphic Organizer assignment. Go to your Google Drive. Go to folder number 3, Materials and Assignments. There, under Unit 1/1-A, you have a folder called Materials and Assignments. And what you're going to pull out there is entitled the Native American Graphic Organizer. And now I want you to spend the time you have remaining in class in about 30 minutes tonight, and I want to see how far you get before our next class period. You're going to be assigned a region where these tribes existed, regions of present-day United States and some into present-day Canada, okay? And for the area that you've been assigned, let's say it's the Northwest Coast, what states is that today? What tribes exist? Tell me about what you would say is notable about religious or government structure, primary food sources. What about some famous or infamous conflicts with white America? All right, and tribes today, what has happened to them as a result? What is the status and the material health of these tribes today? Maybe choose a couple key ones from your region, okay? So again, there's a lot of meat on this bone. I'm asking you to do about an hour's worth of work between class and homework, one tribe, and complete this graphic organizer as best you can, okay? I've given you a map. So when you see these regions listed, right, you see them up here listed the same on a map. You can find your tribe. What is your tribe? If your last name is A through K, you are going to take any tribe west of the Great Plains, like the Great Basin, not tribes, excuse me, regions. You would take the Plateau region, for instance, and you would write about the Nez, the Perche, and the Cayuse. Or the Northwest Coast, and you have the Chinook, okay? If your last name is L through P, you are going to focus on the Great Plains region. And if you are Q through Z, you are going to choose any one region east of the Great Plains. You could take then the Southeast region or the Eastern Woodlands, okay? And go to complete your graphic organizer, okay? And so we want to understand, as we'll talk more about the key objectives, APUSH objectives 1.1, 1.2, we want to understand a little bit more about these native societies that belonged in this country prior to European exploration, long before the English and long before any notion of America. All right, so that's your work in class, that's your work tonight. All right, so that is all I got for you. Hopefully all of this makes sense, and I will see you in our next class together. Thanks a lot, guys. Take care.